Okay, this lesson is going to be Marine Biology Module 4, which is the first module that deals with marine invertebrates. So we're now starting Kingdom Animalia, and Kingdom Animalia is usually subdivided into the vertebrates that have a backbone. And we'll talk about those in more detail later. And then the invertebrates are those organisms that do not have a backbone. And if you were to combine all the other organisms in all the other kingdoms, put them together, the number of species in the invertebrates would outnumber all of the others combined. And most of these invertebrates are most of them live in the ocean, so they are marine animals. So we're going to start working our way through the invertebrates by working our way through different phyla. So the first phylum that we will discuss is phylum Porifera. And in the name Porifera, this means that they have pores or small holes in them. And the organisms that make up phylum Porifera are the sponges. Sponges do not move. They are attached to the bottom of the ocean floor, and they have pores that water enters in through, and then plankton is in that water, so they can then consume the plankton that is brought into the sponges through those pores. So let's take a look at some pictures of sponges. So this is a tube sponge. There are all kinds of different sponges. Some are large, some are small, some are hard and some are soft, so there's a wide variety, but this is one example of a sponge that is called a pore sponge. Then this figure shows some of the primary structures that we are going to pay attention to that are part of a sponge. So the first thing I want to point out is the pore that we've already talked about, that we've already mentioned. Okay, so here's the pore, and they allow water to, so there's a specialized type of cell called a pore cell, and they allow water to enter into the sponge, so allows water to move in. And as I said, then they also, with that water comes plankton, so they can get food that way. Another type of specialized cell, let's go ahead and erase this. Another type of specialized cell is called the collar cell. We'll make that one blue. So here's the collar cell. And these cells, as you can see here, they have flagellum. And with those flagellum, they help to pull water in, and then the collar cells actually trap the food, and then it gets ingested. So the collar cells are really important for the feeding habits of the sponge. Okay, so that's the collar cells. Next, let's look at the next cell that we will look at is the structure over here that is called the osculum, right here, osculum. And it is a large opening through which water is pushed out. So you can see that this arrow indicates that water is exiting. If the water could not be pushed out, then the organism would continue to swell with water. So the osculum is important for pushing water back out of the cell, or put back out of the sponge. Okay, so those are the three. There are others, and we'll talk about some of these others in just a moment. But of the three main cell types, I want you to know the pore cells, collar cells, so pore cells, collar cells, and the oculum. Okay. Here's a picture of the collar cell enlarged, so you can see here the flagellum that come off of that collar cell that aids in moving the water or moving the water in so that the food can be trapped in there. Okay, we'll come back to this. Let's go back to the whiteboard. Sponges have different body types, and we don't have time to go into all of those, so we're just going to kind of cover general principles. So a couple things that you will see in sponges. The first is called aggregation. And aggregation, if you take a sponge or if a sponge gets broken up into fragments, it will reform itself. All those fragments will come back together and reform into an organism, and that is called aggregation. So reform, the ability to reform from fragments, is called aggregation. Okay, they don't regrow parts that are missing. Aggregation is not regrowing parts that are missing, although they can do that. This is if you break it up, or if it gets broken up into small fragments, those fragments can come back together. Sponges generally have one or the other or both types of material that they are made up of. The first material is called spicules, and the spicules are made of silica. So remember, we saw silica when we looked at the diatom. So silica is the kind of glass-like hard substance. The spicules also have some calcium carbonate in them. Calcium carbonate is what's in Tums. And so both of these spicules kind of act like a skeleton for the sponge. So sponges that have these spicules, it provides support for them and it helps to keep them upright, just like our skeleton does. But it also means that if they have a predominance of spicules, the sponge will be harder, not so soft. Whereas spongin also provides support, but spongin is a softer, and most of the sponges that are used for cleaning would be predominantly contain spongins. So the cells that make these the spicules and the spongin are called amoebocytes. Okay, so anytime you see the word cyte at the end of something, that means it's a cell. So an amoebocyte makes spongin and spicules. Make spongins and spicules. Okay, so if we go back to that figure that we were looking at before, so here that we're showing an amoebocyte. So this is a specialized type of cell within a sponge that produces the spicules. Here's a spicule, and I don't think they show a spongin. So that is an important cell type for the structure of a sponge. I mentioned aggregation. Another thing that we see in sponges is regeneration. So you probably remember this from biology, but sponges are able to so if they regenerate primarily by budding. So a sponge will well, actually, let me back up. What I should say is let's talk about reproduction in general. There's several ways that sponges can reproduce. One way that they can reproduce is they can reproduce by regeneration. So if a part of a sponge gets broken off, then that part can grow into another sponge. Another way that they can reproduce is by budding. And budding just means that like a bud will grow on the sponge, and then that bud can break off and grow into a new sponge. So that's one way that they can reproduce. Another way that they can reproduce is by a gemmule. And a gemmule is when a hard shell forms around some of the cells. And they do that because with that hard shell, they can withstand harsh conditions. And then once the harsh conditions have passed, then that hard shell can open up and it releases those cells, and those cells will grow into a new sponge. So this form of reproduction is used when there's going to be like particularly extreme weather conditions, and they allow the cells to withstand those harsh conditions, and then once the harsh conditions are passed, they can they can be released and grow into sponges. And then lastly, they can reproduce sexually. So let's take a little closer look at sexual reproduction. Basically what happens in sexual reproduction with the sponges is that the collar cells actually develop into eggs and sperm. And then those eggs, the eggs stay with the sponge. The sperm get released into the water and they will swim to another sponge and fertilize the eggs on another sperm. So the eggs stay with the sponge. So the collar cells within a sponge will make both eggs and sperm. The eggs stay there, and then the sperm will leave and go to another sponge and fertilize the eggs in another sponge. Once the egg and sperm once fertilization has taken place, there is a larval stage that is called an amphiblastula. And so that's the larval phase. And what happens is the amphiblastula gets carried in the water, and then it settles on the bottom and grows into a sponge. Okay, so the larval phase that comes about as a result of sexual reproduction is called an amphiblastula. Let's look at a picture of this. So I guess I don't have that for sponges. I guess that's I don't have pictures of the reproductive cycle in a sponge. Okay, so that is going to do it for phylum Porifera, which comprises the sponges. Okay, now we're going to look at phylum Cnidaria. And so the C is silent there, phylum Cnidaria. And this this is the phylum that contains the jellyfish, coral, and sea anemones. Most of these organisms have they generally have two sides. They have an oral side, which is the mouth, and then they have the side opposite, which is called the arboreal side. So that would be the side opposite the mouth. That's usually how they are identified in terms of the different parts of them. Most of the organisms in phylum Cnidaria come in one of two shapes, and for some of them, they will have one shape during part of their life cycle, and they will have the other shape during another part of their life cycle. So some organisms could have different shapes depending on the stage of their life cycle. So A polyp looks like a sac. And it is usually attached to something. And then a medusa looks more like an umbrella. And medusas are usually free swimming. So they're not attached to anything. So like a sea anemone is an example of a polyp. And what we typically think of as a jellyfish is in the medusa form. However, jellyfish actually do go through a polyp stage. So let me show you a picture of that. So here is here's an example of an organism that a sea anemone that is in the polyp phase, and then the jellyfish is in the medusa phase. Although as we see here, the larva here almost they are basically similar to a polyp. When you have a medusa stage, you usually have the tentacles that are around the mouth. So here's the tentacles, and they surround the mouth. So those tentacles are used to help capture food. And so there's actually a special type of cell that is on the tentacles that are called nematocysts. So they're on the tentacles, and what they do is they sting or they paralyze the prey. So that that's the way that they can capture the food, and then it gets moved into the mouth using the tentacles. And they don't have a true digestive system, because in a true digestive system you have like an opening that's the mouth, and then you have another opening on the other end that's called the anus. Well, in a jellyfish, there what is called the gastrovascular cavity. It has an opening for food to enter, and the food gets digested there, but the cells are so thin that the waste can go right through the cells to get eliminated. So the gastrovascular cavity only has one opening. It doesn't need an opening to eliminate the waste, because the waste can just be eliminated right through the cells. Let's see if I show you a picture so you can see the difference between the polyp phase and so here's that's the wrong picture. Yeah, okay, so here's a picture of so this one would be the polyp phase here. You can see these are the polyp phase, and the medusa stage, the medusa with the polyp with the tentacles hanging down, that's an example of that would be in the jellyfish, and then this is the Portuguese man of war. And I'll say a few things about each of those in just a moment, but I just wanted to at least let you look at some of those organisms. in phylum Cnidarian, reproduction can happen in several ways. One is that the medusa can reproduce sexually by producing eggs and sperm. When this happens, what gets formed is something called a planula, and then that planula, depending on the species, that planula could become a polyp or it could become a medusa. And we'll look at that in a figure in just a moment. Okay, but it's sexual reproduction. The egg and sperm form a planula, then that planula can either be, it can become a polyp in some species, and in other species it will become a medusa. So one way that reproduction can happen is sexually through the medusa. A second way that reproduction can take place, so we're still talking about reproduction. A second way that reproduction can take place is that the polyps can bud. So remember, budding just means that a bud grows on the organism, and that bud can break off and become another organism. The polyps can also reproduce sexually. So one way the polyps can reproduce is by budding. A second way that they can reproduce is sexually. And then, with sexual, you have the egg and the sperm. And those egg and sperm can then become either a polyp or a medusa, just like we saw with the medusa form in reproduction. Okay, so polyps can bud to reproduce. They can also reproduce sexually through the formation of eggs and sperm. So let's look at one of these pictures. Let's go back to the previous one, actually, if I can get back there. I didn't eliminate all those. Okay, so this is the figure I want. See if that'll come up. There we go. Okay, so this is just a summary of what we just said. So the medusa can reproduce sexually with an egg and a sperm. Okay, so the medusa reproduce sexually with egg and sperm. These planula form, and then this shows that the planula can become a medusa, but in other species it will become a polyp. Okay, but it's sexual reproduction. And then with a polyp, we saw that one way that reproduction can occur is it can occur by budding. So here's the polyp, and reproduction can occur with budding. But then the polyp can also form eggs and sperm that will become a polyp, but they can also form eggs and sperm that will form a medusa. So the polyp can reproduce asexually by budding, but it can also reproduce sexually and lead either to a medusa or a polyp, depending on the particular species. Okay, we do not have time to go into the different types of the different classes of cnidarians. That's all we're going to say about cnidarians, just because we don't have time to go into all of the classes. If you're interested in those, you can read about them in your book, and we will talk about some of them in more detail, like when we study coral reefs, we'll talk a little bit more about the organisms that make up a coral reef. Okay, so that was phylum Cnidarian. The next phylum that we will talk about is phylum Ctenophora. So again, the C is silent, Ctenophora. And I'm just going to mention one organism that belongs to this phylum, and that is the comb jellies. And we'll see when we're going to look at a picture, but there is basically 8 rows of combs. And those combs are like cilia. They are cilia. And they beat, and their purpose really is just to allow the comb jelly to stay upright in the water. So the cilia aren't for movement. They are to help the organism stay upright. So these comb jellies still float in the water. So because they just float, as we learned last week, they would be classified as plankton. So the cilia are just to help them stay upright in the water. So let's go ahead and look at a picture of one of those. Here's one. Oh. So here is a picture of a comb jelly, and if you count these, you can see that there are these 8 rows of combs that are cilia that help to keep this organism upright in the water. So they are beautiful, a beautiful organism, and just one of the marvels of God's creation. Okay, the last group of organisms that we are going to talk about then are the worms. Maybe you don't think about having worms in the ocean, but as we'll see, there are a lot of different kinds of worms. The one thing that is, so worms are, the rest of the organisms that we look at in the animal kingdom have they have some type of brain. So let's before we get into worms specifically, the rest of the organisms in the animal kingdom, so the remaining animals, they have some sort of a brain. It might be a pretty simple brain, so it might just be a mass of nervous tissue, but it is some form of some type of a brain. And they have a front and a back, and they have a top surface that is called the dorsal surface. So this would be the top. or depending on if it's a two-legged creature like humans, the dorsal surface would be the back of it, but for most organisms, it's going to be the top surface. And then the ventral surface is the bottom surface, or the belly side. So in us, it would be our fronts, the belly side, or the bottom. So if you have an organism that, if you have something that is a quadruped that walks on 4 legs, well, actually, if we had like a fish. Okay, so the fish, the dorsal side would be up here, the back side, and then the down side would be the ventral side. Okay, and that's going to be true of most, it would be the upper surface and the lower surface for most marine animals. Okay, so now let's talk about worms. And there are different phylum that make up the worms. And we'll talk about some of those. The first one is phylum Helminthes, or well, Platyhelminthes. Sometimes these are just referred to as the Helminthes. That's a mouthful. It's pretty phonetic. Platyhelminthes, and these are what would typically be called the flatworms. So as I said, their brain is just a collection of nerves. So they don't have it's not a complicated brain like our brain, but they do have a collection of nerves that make up their brain. I'll show you a picture of one of these organisms. This is called a turbarian, and it is an example of a flatworm. They can be really colorful. You can see some color on this one. And they have mucus on their belly. So some of the characteristics of this, let's see, maybe I'll write on here with white. So they have mucus on their belly. Oh. And that allows them to slide along the ocean floor. So that's one way that they move. The primary way that they move is by sliding along the ocean floor. Can't see them too well in this picture, but they also have cilia. And those cilia also they can swim with those cilia. So with the combination of their cilia and this mucus, they are able to move along the ocean floor. Okay, so Turbellaria is one type of the flatworms. Another category. So we have flatworms, and let's see. So one that we just mentioned are the Turbellaria. And then another type, these are called the Trematoda. And the two that maybe you have heard of that fit in this category, one are the flukes, and the other is tapeworm. And let me talk about flukes first. So Trematodia are flukes and tapeworms. Let me talk about flukes. Both of these organisms have some implications for humans. So that's why I want to make sure that we talk about them. The first are the flukes, and in their larval stage, the flukes will live in clams, they'll live in snails, and they'll live in some fish. And then when a vertebrate, so these are non-vertebrates, but when a vertebrate eats these organisms, then the adult fluke lives in the vertebrates. Okay, so vertebrates consume these clams, snails, or fish, and then the adults live in the vertebrates. So that can mean that humans can have some flukes, but also things like whales or larger fish. The flukes will live in them because they are vertebrates. I don't mean to say invertebrates. I say they live in the vertebrates. Okay, so flukes they are parasites. I guess we haven't thrown that word out yet, but in biology we've talked about parasites. So parasites are an organism that feed on another organism. So one organism is benefited and the other organism is harmed. So flukes are a parasite in that they harm the clams and snails and fish in their larval form, and then they will harm adult flukes by living off of those organisms. Okay, then the other thing that I talked about were tapeworm. And they also are parasites, and they live in the intestines of vertebrates, including humans. And the thing about tapeworms is they do not have a digestive system. So because they do not have a digestive system, they rely on the organism that they're living in to digest the food. So if they're living in your intestines, your intestines will digest the food, and then they just absorb the nutrients right into their bodies, because they're not able to do the digestion themselves. So they rely on their host organism to be able to survive. If we have time at the end, I will show you some pictures of tapeworm, but I want to get through the rest of these phyla before we run out of time. Next, we will talk about phylum Nematoda, Nemertea. And these are referred to as ribbon worms. So they look just like they sound. They look like ribbons. And you will find these on the bottom of bodies of water, usually in shallow water. The thing about Nemertea is that they do have a true digestive system. So their digestive system goes from there, it starts in the mouth and it goes to the anus. So they take in food through the mouth, travels through the digestive system and gets eliminated. Another thing that this organism has is a large proboscis. Usually we think like a butterfly has a proboscis. That's what they use to siphon nectar. In humans, the term proboscis is used for our nose, but in this case, for this type of worm, they have a long tongue. So maybe you've never thought about worms having tongues, but they have a long tongue that they use to trap their prey. So they trap the prey in their tongue, and then they inject it with toxins, also from the tongue, and then they can use that tongue to pull it into their mouth. And then, as I said, that from the mouth, then it goes through the digestive system, and they extract nutrients from it. So this proboscis is a unique characteristic of phylum Nemertea. Okay, next we will talk about phylum Nematoda. And phylum Nematoda are the roundworms. So these tend to be found in ocean sediment. So the roundworms feed on bacteria. So in that sense, they perform an important function for the marine environment. However, they are also parasites, and they will live in fish. So sometimes when people consume raw fish, they will get these parasites. So in our country, people are increasingly eating raw fish and things like sushi, and you can get these roundworms from consuming raw fish. You can also get tapeworm, and I'm going to show you some of that in a moment, or if we have time. But phylum Nematoda they can be parasitic, and you can get them by consuming raw fish. Okay. The last one that we will talk about then is phylum Annelida. And these are segmented worms. So you probably at some point have dissected a earthworm. So, I mean, obviously earthworms are not marine, but they are an example of a segmented worm. The thing about segmented worms is that they have a digestive system that runs the entire length of their body. So their digestive system goes from the mouth to the anus. And they have a structure that is called a coelom. Okay, so this is pronounced coelom. And It's a body. It's the body cavity that's divided into segments. And this body cavity fills with fluid, and then the muscles contract, and as the muscles contract against that fluid, then that causes movement. So if you ever watched an earthworm move, you know that they kind of move by moving different segments of their body, and that's because their body is divided into these body cavities that are called coelom. Let's see if I have any pictures of these. I don't. Let's see. Yeah, so I guess that's all I am going to say about phylum Annelida. There are some, your book does talk about some different worms that are in that category. They mentioned the tree worm and a tube worm, but I generally just want you to know the general characteristics of these rather than trying to focus on specific organisms. Let me see if I can find, I want to try to show you a picture of a, so this is a picture. This is a picture of a man who was a patient in, I believe it was, I'm pretty sure it was India, and he had been eating pork that was undercooked, and as a result, he got tapeworm. And in this particular case, they actually took an instrument with a hook on the end of it, and they took that instrument and put it down his mouth and down his esophagus and into his stomach and intestine, and they actually pulled the tapeworm out through his mouth. So this bottom picture here, you can see that is the length of the tapeworm. So the tapeworm can be quite long. I forget how long they said this one was, but they can be quite long, and this one was pulled out in one segment through the mouth. Often what they will do is if a person contracts tapeworm, they will give you a medicine that will kill it, and it'll break up into pieces, and then it just gets eliminated from the body. But in this case, it was still intact, and they pulled the whole thing out in one piece. The other thing that I will try to show you, and I'll see if I can find it. My son sent me a video. Should have looked this up ahead of time. this, if I can get this video up, that yellow thing that you see moving there is a tapeworm, and this was a tapeworm that was removed from a man's intestine in South Korea. Again, a place where a lot of raw fish are consumed. So tapeworms do have implications in marine biology because they can live, the larva can live in fish, and then when vertebrates consume them, then we can get them. Okay, so this is the tapeworm that you see there. Okay, I think we will stop there, and that's going to finish it up for module 4 for the beginning of the marine invertebrates. We'll be covering more marine invertebrates in the next chapter, but that's going to finish it for module 4.